On November 2, 1988, a graduate student sat at a terminal and launched code that would slow the early internet to a crawl. It began as a quiet late-night test in a campus lab where terminals glowed and experiments felt routine. He compiled a compact program, set a few flags, and pushed it into a network stitched together by collegial trust. No alarms sounded. Packets drifted across research links, carrying a self-propelling payload that treated every reachable machine as a potential host. Through university backbones and government lines, across systems named for planets and poets, the code found doors left ajar by habit and convenience. Minutes turned into hours. Processes stalled. Logins lagged. By sunrise, what looked like a small experiment had become a continental incident, and the network's innocence had cracked. In 1988, the internet linked on the order of tens of thousands of Unix hosts, mostly universities, research labs, and a few government agencies. It was a federation of peers who often knew one another by name. Collaboration was the point, so friction was removed wherever possible. Defaults favored openness. Services shipped with debugging features, enabled because developers needed them. Remote administration leaned on host-based trust rather than strong per-session authentication. A machine listed in a user's trusted files could log in without a password via RSH. Convenience trumped skepticism. Passwords themselves skewed memorable, not robust, reflecting a culture that assumed the person on the other end was a colleague, not an adversary. Software reflected these assumptions. Mail transfer agents exposed features intended for troubleshooting. Simple directory and presence services accepted whatever input arrived. Networks were flat, internal segments were porous, and the idea of perimeters was more architectural than defensive. Patching cycles were slow, distribution mechanisms were manual, and documentation traveled by mailing list and tape. The system worked because the participants shared norms, and because the population of connected machines was small enough that trust felt rational. That same trust, embedded in defaults and habits, created seams a determined program could pull, seams no one had seriously tested at internet scale. Into this environment, one graduate student released a new kind of program. The program was a worm, a standalone, self-replicating program that spreads without user action. Unlike a virus, which hides in a file and waits to be launched, a worm carries its own engine for movement. Once running, it scouts for new systems, copies itself over the network, and starts again. Connectivity becomes fuel. This worm, later known as the Morris worm, chained multiple routes to maximize reach. One was Sendmail, the ubiquitous Unix mail transfer agent. A hidden debug mode, intended for testing, could be coaxed into executing commands mid-conversation. The worm used it to drop a small bootstrap and retrieve the main payload. A second vector hit Fingered, the daemon behind the finger utility that reported who was logged in. Fingered contained a buffer overflow. An overlong request could overwrite memory and redirect execution, handing control to the worm. The code also exploited trusted hosts and RSH relationships defined in users' and systems' trust files, leaping across machines that bypassed passwords. Where credentials were needed, it tried common guesses against local accounts, betting, often correctly, that weak choices would open doors. Each infection began with a tiny dropper that fetched the full program, then scanned neighbors and repeated the process. To avoid obvious loops, the worm checked if a host already carried a copy. But the author, Robert Tappan Morris, worried administrators would forge that signal. He added a probabilistic override. Even when a machine reported infection, the worm reinstalled itself roughly 1 time in 7, about 14% of attempts. That single design choice turned an outbreak into a choke. Multiple copies piled up on the same host, each consuming CPU and memory until legitimate work starved. The worm did not erase files. It denied service by suffocating resources. Propagation was swift. Within a day, thousands of prominent systems were sluggish or unresponsive, roughly a tenth of the connected internet. Email queued for hours, compilers crawled, shells froze mid-command. Some institutions severed external links to shield campus networks. Others shut down vulnerable services. Coordination sprang up wherever channels still worked. Administrators convened by telephone and on surviving mailing lists. Reverse-engineered binaries recovered from memory and circulated instructions: kill rogue processes, remove droppers, disable Sendmail's debug mode, patch or replace fingered, lock down trust files, rotate weak passwords. The early internet, still more community than industry, learned incident response on the fly. The shock produced structure. In the days that followed, the U.S. Defense Department tasked Carnegie Mellon University with establishing a permanent coordination center for computer emergencies. CERT-CC, the Computer Emergency Response Team Coordination Center, formed to issue advisories, coordinate with vendors, and give responders a shared picture during crises. What began as heroics by scattered volunteers became a repeatable practice with playbooks, contacts, and distribution lists. Tracing the origin required persistence. Early activity pointed to an MIT host, but that was camouflage. The author was Robert Tappan Morris, a Cornell graduate student who launched from MIT's network to obscure the trail. Forensic work with logs and code behavior, along with corroborating details, led back to him. Cleanup consumed weeks of staff time across institutions, and disruption to research and communication was measured in lost work and delayed results. A single program had bent a national research network to its knees. Federal prosecutors turned to the relatively new Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986, which criminalized unauthorized access to protected computers. Morris's case became its first high-profile test. In 1990, a jury found him guilty, making him the first person convicted under the CFAA. The court imposed 3 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, and a $10,050 fine plus costs. The message was clear. On shared networks, intent would not outweigh effect and authorization. Administrators hardened defaults. Debug features stopped shipping exposed on production services. The principle of least privilege gained ground. Processes ran with minimal rights. Trust relationships became explicit and rare. Host-based trust gave way to authenticated protocols, and password policies strengthened. Developers treated input as hostile by default, and defenses against memory errors, from compiler warnings to safer libraries, gained urgency. Incident response matured alongside prevention, with CERT-CC and later teams institutionalizing rapid sharing and coordinated patching. The specifics of the Morris worm, Sendmail's debug path, Fingered's overflow, RSH trust, and probabilistic reinfection, became enduring case studies of insecure defaults, unchecked input, implicit trust, and adversaries who anticipate deception. The internet did not break in November 1988, but it grew up. A system designed for open collaboration met a self-replicating program that turned openness into fuel. From a quiet terminal and a single keystroke, the network learned that scale changes risk, and that secure by default is not a luxury, but the cost of connection. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Morris worm, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Cyber Nightmares. Hit the bell icon so you won't miss our next episode, where we'll unravel more gripping tales from the hidden corners of the internet.